It began as a hushed exchange deep within Windsor's inner corridors, one that even senior aides reportedly tried to bury. But when Princess Anne was seen leaving that meeting with an expression described by insiders as unforgiving, the silence shattered. Something had been uncovered. And at the center of it all stood Queen Camilla. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What started as a routine day behind palace walls soon twisted into something far more unsettling, as subtle irregularities began surfacing small enough to dismiss at first, yet persistent enough to unsettle even the most seasoned royal observers. Reports quietly emerged, suggesting Anne had been alerted to unusual staff movements. Patterns that didn't align with the rigid structure she had upheld for decades, and the deeper she looked, the more the unease grew. These weren't simple scheduling overlaps or harmless miscommunications, they carried a rhythm, a coordination that hinted at intention rather than coincidence. Palace aides, long trusted to operate within strict protocols, were allegedly holding meetings that existed outside official channels. Gatherings that left no formal trace, yet seemed to influence decisions within the household. At first, there were attempts calculated and careful to dismiss these concerns as nothing more than routine domestic coordination, the kind of internal adjustments that rarely warranted scrutiny. But Anne was not one to accept convenient explanations, not when discipline and order had defined her entire role within the monarchy. Her reputation for precision, for demanding accountability at every level, made her reaction all the more striking. This was not irritation. This was something deeper, sharper, a recognition that the structure she had trusted might be shifting beneath her feet. And as whispers began to circulate among senior courtiers, the atmosphere within the palace subtly changed. Conversations grew quieter when certain names were mentioned, glances lingered a second too long, and an unspoken tension settled into the very fabric of daily operations. No one dared to speak openly, yet everyone seemed to sense that something was unfolding behind closed doors. Something that did not belong to the carefully managed image of unity the royal household projected to the world. The more Anne pressed, the more resistance she encountered, not overt defiance, but a quiet deflection, a reluctance to engage that only deepened the mystery. And with each passing moment, the weight of what she might uncover grew heavier, casting a shadow that stretched far beyond a simple breach of protocol. Because this was no longer about misplaced authority or minor internal missteps, it was about control, influence, and the possibility that unseen forces were quietly reshaping the balance within the palace itself. But what Anne uncovered wasn't just a breach of protocol, it hinted at a deeper network operating within the palace itself. Behind the polished routines of royal life, insiders whisper of a parallel structure: quiet meetings, selective invitations, and conversations that never reached official records. And according to multiple interpretations, these gatherings weren't random. They were deliberate, strategic, and allegedly orchestrated with one goal in mind: control. As the earlier tensions surrounding Princess Anne's discovery continued to ripple through the palace, a new layer of unease began to surface, one that felt less like a misstep and more like a carefully constructed system operating just beyond the reach of formal authority. Reports began to circulate, quiet at first, almost hesitant, suggesting that Queen Camilla had been holding informal meetings with a tightly chosen circle of staff, individuals whose loyalty had been tested and proven over years of service. These were not the grand, documented briefings that defined royal operations. These were smaller, quieter exchanges, where decisions could be shaped without the weight of official oversight. And perhaps most striking of all was how these interactions seemed to bypass the traditional palace hierarchy entirely, slipping past established communication chains as if they no longer held the same authority they once did. For those within the institution who had long relied on structure and order, this shift was deeply unsettling. The monarchy had always functioned like a finely tuned machine, each role clearly defined, each voice carefully placed within a chain of command that ensured balance. But now, that balance appeared to be bending. Long-serving aides, figures who understood the palace better than most, were reportedly at the center of these quiet exchanges. Their allegiance not necessarily to the institution as a whole, but to Camilla herself. And that distinction, subtle as it may seem, carried enormous weight, because influence was being redirected through personal loyalty rather than institutional protocol. then the very foundation of royal governance risked being quietly reshaped. Conversations within these circles were said to revolve around access, positioning, and influence: who could speak, who would be heard, and perhaps most crucially, who would be left out entirely. The timing only deepened the sense of unease. With King Charles reportedly facing periods of reduced capacity, the palace found itself in a moment of quiet vulnerability, a space where leadership could become fluid, where decisions might be guided by those closest to the center rather than those formally appointed to lead. It was within this fragile window that these alleged meetings gained significance, no longer appearing as isolated events, but as part of something more coordinated, more intentional. Administrative officials, bound by duty to maintain order, began raising concerns carefully worded, cautiously delivered about what they described as irregular coordination. It was a phrase that revealed little on the surface, yet carried a heavy implication beneath it, suggesting that something was unfolding outside the bounds of accepted practice. And still, no one moved openly against it. Perhaps because they couldn't. Or perhaps because the full extent of what was happening had yet to be fully understood. What made it all the more unsettling was the silence that followed these revelations. Not denial, not confirmation, just a growing absence of clarity, as if the truth itself was being carefully managed, revealed only in fragments to those willing to look closely enough. And as the pieces began to align, a chilling question started to take shape: if these meetings were not random, if they were indeed deliberate and strategic, then what exactly were they building toward? Because beneath the surface of routine and tradition, something far more calculated seemed to be taking form, something that extended beyond influence and into the realm of preparation. But the real shock wasn't the meetings themselves, it was what they may have been preparing for. Why now? Why risk such a delicate maneuver at a time when the monarchy is already under strain? According to those familiar with internal discussions, the answer may lie in legacy: who shapes it, who controls it, and who ultimately inherits its influence. As the quiet network of meetings began to take on clearer meaning, what once seemed like isolated coordination started to resemble something far more calculated, almost inevitable. The question was no longer whether influence was being exercised behind closed doors, but why it was happening with such urgency. And the answer, whispered cautiously among those closest to the institution, pointed toward the future: not the present tensions, but the long game of positioning, authority, and the silent rewriting of who holds power when the current chapter closes. Because within the monarchy, legacy is not just symbolic, it is structure. It is control over decisions that ripple far beyond the palace walls, shaping narratives that endure for generations. Speculation grew sharper, more defined, suggesting that these discrete gatherings were not merely about managing the present, but about securing influence over what comes next. Conversations were believed to touch on staff appointments: who would rise, who would remain, and who might quietly be edged aside. Internal operations, once governed by tradition and collective oversight, now appeared vulnerable to subtle redirection, as if the very mechanisms that upheld the institution were being recalibrated from within. And at the center of this quiet recalibration stood a circle: Camilla's extended network individuals, whose proximity granted them not just access, but a voice in decisions that could shape the monarchy's internal landscape. It was not overt, it was not declared, but it was felt: a shift in tone, a change in who was consulted and who was left waiting outside the conversation. For senior royals, those who had dedicated their lives to preserving the monarchy as a sacred trust, this emerging pattern carried a weight that was difficult to ignore. The institution had always been larger than any single figure, bound by duty, continuity, and a shared understanding that no one person could claim ownership over its direction. And yet, beneath the surface, something was beginning to challenge that very principle. Concerns grew not loudly, not publicly, but with a quiet intensity that signaled deeper unease. Because influence was being consolidated, if decisions were being shaped by a select few operating beyond traditional boundaries, then the integrity of the system itself was at risk of being questioned. And once that question is asked, it does not easily fade. What made the situation even more volatile was how subtle the struggle remained. There were no declarations, no open confrontations, only a growing sense that two forces were beginning to form: one rooted in tradition and institutional balance, the other in strategic alignment and controlled influence. It was a power struggle, but not one fought in the open. It moved quietly, through conversations, through decisions that seemed minor on the surface but carried deeper implications beneath. And as each piece fell into place, the tension that had once been hidden began to sharpen, taking on a form that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. Because this was no longer just about meetings or influence, it was about the future identity of the monarchy itself. And as the implications became clearer, one figure refused to remain silent. When Princess Anne acts, she does so without hesitation, and insiders suggest that what followed was nothing short of a bureaucratic counterstrike, swift, precise, and impossible to ignore. The quiet tension that had been building beneath the surface suddenly found direction as Anne moved with a clarity that left little room for doubt or delay. There was no dramatic announcement, no public declaration of intent, only action. Immediate, calculated, and deeply rooted in her unwavering belief that the monarchy's strength lies in its discipline. Reports indicate that she initiated internal reviews of staff activity, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a direct response to the irregular patterns that had begun to emerge. Every movement, every unsanctioned interaction, every deviation from established protocol was brought under scrutiny. And within the palace walls, that shift was felt instantly. Conversations became measured. Decisions slowed under the weight of oversight. The atmosphere, once clouded with uncertainty, tightened into something far more controlled. What made Anne's response so striking was not just its speed, but its precision. This was not a sweeping reaction driven by emotion. It was targeted, deliberate, and rooted in structure. Unofficial meetings and quiet communications, once dismissed or overlooked, were now subject to heightened examination. The very channels that had allowed influence to move quietly were being illuminated, one by one, leaving little space for ambiguity. And, as scrutiny increased, so did the pressure on those who had operated within that gray area. The message was clear, even if it was never spoken aloud. The boundaries had been crossed, and they would now be firmly redrawn. Protocols that had long defined palace operations were reinforced with renewed authority, not as relics of tradition, but as essential safeguards against exactly the kind of shift that had begun to take hold. At the same time, Anne was not acting in isolation. Alignment with key figures within the royal structure began to surface, most notably with Prince William, whose own commitment to preserving institutional integrity had never been in question. This convergence of authority added weight to the response, transforming it from an individual stance into something far more unified. Together, they represented a force that was not easily challenged, a reinforcement of order, at a moment when the system itself appeared vulnerable. Insiders began referring to this phase as an iron protocol response, a term that carried both respect and warning. Because this was not simply about correcting irregularities, it was about reasserting control over the very framework that governed the monarchy's internal life. Across palace departments, the signals were unmistakable. Discipline was not just being restored, it was being redefined with sharper edges, leaving little room for interpretation. Staff who had once operated with quiet flexibility now found themselves navigating a far more rigid environment, where every action carried weight and every decision was subject to accountability. And while this restoration of order brought a sense of stability, it also deepened the underlying tension, because such decisive action rarely occurs without consequence. It draws lines, it forces positions, and it reveals where loyalties truly lie. What had once been subtle was now unmistakable, a clash not of personalities, but of principles, unfolding within one of the most guarded institutions in the world. And as the impact of Anne's counterstrike began to ripple outward, it became clear that this was no longer contained within internal corridors or quiet conversations. But this wasn't just an internal correction, it would soon reach the highest level of the monarchy. At the center of the storm stands King Charles III, a monarch reportedly weakened, yet still the ultimate authority. And now, he faces an impossible balance: loyalty to his wife or duty to the institution he was sworn to protect. As the internal tension intensified following Princess Anne's decisive intervention, the weight of what had been unfolding could no longer remain contained within quiet corridors and guarded conversations. Reports suggest that Charles was formally briefed on the situation, not in fragments or softened interpretations, but in full every irregular movement, every unofficial meeting, every implication of influence that had begun to reshape the palace from within. And for a king already navigating the strain of ongoing health challenges, the timing could not have been more critical or more unforgiving. Because leadership, even under pressure, demands clarity, and clarity in this moment came with consequences. Those close to the inner circle describe a growing sense of urgency surrounding Charles, not just from the situation itself, but from the voices around him. Princess Anne, unwavering in her stance, reportedly made it clear that inaction was not an option. Senior royals, equally concerned about the preservation of institutional integrity, added their own weight to that pressure, forming a quiet but undeniable force urging the king to step in, to define the line between personal allegiance and constitutional duty. But this was no simple decision. This was not a matter of policy or procedure, it was deeply personal. Because at the heart of it stood Queen Camilla, his partner, his confidant. Someone whose role in his life extended far beyond the formal boundaries of monarchy. And now, those two worlds, his private loyalty and his public responsibility, were colliding in a way that demanded resolution. The emotional strain of that collision did not remain hidden. Observers began to note subtle but telling signs during recent appearances, moments where the composure expected of a monarch seemed just slightly strained, where the weight behind his words carried something heavier than usual. Nothing overt, nothing that could be pointed to directly, but enough to suggest that the pressure behind palace doors was beginning to surface, even if only in the smallest of ways. Because when the foundation of an institution is tested, it does not just challenge its structure, it challenges those who are tasked with holding it together. And Charles, despite his position, was not immune to that weight. In fact, he was at its very center. What made the situation even more precarious was the broader implication of his decision. This was no longer about resolving internal disagreements or restoring procedural order. This was about the stability of the monarchy itself. Because if the king chose silence, it could be interpreted as acceptance. If he chose intervention, it could fracture relationships that had long been central to his personal world. Either path carried risk. Either path would define not just the outcome of this moment, but the tone of his reign moving forward. And as the tension reached its peak, the palace found itself suspended in a fragile state, waiting not just for a decision, but for a signal of where the balance of power truly lay. And as the pressure mounted, the consequences began to ripple outward. What began as whispers has now reportedly reshaped the atmosphere inside the palace. Staff movements scrutinized, invitations reconsidered, and a sense, according to insiders, that the old rules are back and stricter than ever. The shift was not announced, yet it was unmistakable. In the wake of Princess Anne's forceful response and the mounting pressure surrounding King Charles's position, the internal machinery of the monarchy began to recalibrate with an intensity that left little room for ambiguity. Internal audits and reviews were reportedly set into motion, not as routine exercises, but as deliberate efforts to trace the flow of influence that had quietly taken root. Every department, every role, every connection was examined with renewed focus, as if the institution itself was turning inward, determined to identify where its boundaries had been tested and where they had been crossed. For those who had operated within the informal networks that once thrived in the shadows, the consequences began to surface in subtle but significant ways. Staff were quietly reassigned, their positions adjusted just enough to signal a shift without drawing overt attention. Others found themselves distanced from the circles that had once granted them proximity and influence, their access no longer guaranteed, their voices no longer amplified in the same way. These were not dramatic dismissals or public reckonings, but something far more controlled, measured corrections that carried a clear message. The structure was being restored, and with it, the understanding that deviation would not go unnoticed. Social and professional consequences followed, not always visible from the outside, but deeply felt within the palace walls, where reputation and access are as powerful as any formal title. As this quiet restructuring unfolded, a deeper divide began to take shape, one that had perhaps existed beneath the surface for some time, but was now impossible to ignore. On one side stood the traditionalists, those who believed firmly in the preservation of hierarchy, in the strict adherence to protocols that had defined the monarchy for generations. On the other, a more modern approach, one that valued flexibility, influence, and the ability to adapt to changing dynamics within the institution. What had once been a subtle difference in perspective now felt like a fault line, stretching across the internal landscape of the palace, creating tension that could not easily be resolved. Because this was no longer just about process or preference, it was about identity, about what the monarchy is and what it is becoming. In response, the reinforcement of hierarchy became more pronounced, not as a reaction born of fear, but as a deliberate assertion of control. Official channels were re-established as the primary path for communication and decision-making, leaving little space for the kind of informal coordination that had previously taken hold. The palace environment, once layered with quiet complexity, began to feel more controlled, more contained, almost as if every movement was now part of a larger effort to restore balance. Yet beneath that control, the tension remained. Because while order can be reimposed, the memory of disruption does not simply disappear. It lingers, shaping how decisions are made, how trust is given, and how power is perceived. And as the immediate fallout settled into a new, quieter rhythm, a more profound question began to emerge, one that extended far beyond staff movements or internal discipline. Because moments like this do not just redefine the present, they echo into the future, influencing how the institution evolves and who ultimately guides that evolution. But beyond the immediate fallout lies a deeper question: what does this mean for the future of the crown? This isn't just about meetings or missteps. It's about something far larger than the enduring question of who safeguards the monarchy's future and whether its sacred traditions can withstand internal fractures. As the immediate tensions settle into a quieter, more controlled rhythm, what remains is not resolution, but reflection and awareness that something fundamental has been tested, perhaps even altered. Because the monarchy has never been about individuals alone. It is a living legacy, shaped by those who pass through it, yet never fully belonging to any one of them. And in moments like this, when unseen pressures begin to surface, that legacy is forced into the spotlight, revealing just how fragile and how resilient it truly is. The events unfolding behind palace walls are no longer isolated disruptions. They are part of a larger narrative, one that questions not only how power is exercised, but who is entrusted to protect it. Within that narrative, Princess Anne has emerged not simply as a participant, but as a figure of unwavering resolve, a guardian of tradition in its purest form. Her actions, decisive and unyielding, reflect a belief that the monarchy's strength lies in its consistency, in the discipline that has carried it through generations of upheaval. To her, the institution is not a space for quiet experimentation or subtle redefinition. It is a structure built on continuity, one that demands protection even when that protection comes at a personal or relational cost. And yet, standing in contrast to that approach is a different vision, one that critics associate with Queen Camilla, a perspective that appears more fluid, more attuned to influence and adaptation within the shifting dynamics of modern royal life. It is not a simple opposition of right and wrong, but a deeper divergence in philosophy, one that raises difficult questions about what the monarchy must become in order to endure. This tension between continuity and change is not new. History has seen it before, moments where the balance of power within the royal family has been quietly contested, where influence has shifted beneath the surface long before it was ever acknowledged publicly. These echoes of the past now seem to resonate once again, threading through the present with a familiarity that is both unsettling and revealing. Because every era of the monarchy has faced its own internal challenges, its own struggles to define where authority truly lies. And each time, the outcome has left a lasting mark, reshaping not only relationships within the palace, but the very perception of the crown itself. Now, as these latest developments unfold, that same sense of quiet pressure begins to build once more. Not explosive or immediate, but steady, persistent, and impossible to ignore. The image of the crown, carefully maintained, deeply symbolic, finds itself under strain, not from external forces, but from within. And that distinction matters, because when challenges arise from inside the institution, they carry a different weight, one that cannot be addressed through tradition alone. It requires decisions, it requires clarity, and perhaps most of all, it requires an understanding of what must be preserved and what must be allowed to evolve. As the palace continues to navigate this delicate moment, the question lingers, growing more defined with each passing day, who will ultimately shape the path forward, and at what cost. And in the end, the outcome may redefine not just relationships, but the very structure of royal power. In the silence that follows upheaval, a new order often takes shape, and according to those watching closely, the palace has entered precisely such a moment, calmer on the surface, but forever changed beneath. The tension that once pulsed through its inner workings has not vanished. It has been absorbed, contained, reshaped into something quieter, yet far more controlled. What remains is not the chaos of uncertainty, but the firm imprint of correction and unmistakable return to strict institutional control, where every role is defined with renewed clarity, and every action carries the weight of accountability. The system, once tested, has responded in the only way it knows how, by reinforcing its core, tightening its structure, and reminding all within it that the monarchy does not bend easily, even under pressure. Yet beneath this restored order, subtle shifts have taken root. Influence, once fluid and quietly contested, now moves with greater caution, redirected through established channels that leave little room for ambiguity. Among senior royals, the balance has adjusted not dramatically, not in ways that would draw public attention, but enough to be felt by those who understand the institution from within. There is a new awareness, a sharpened understanding of where authority resides and how quickly it can be challenged if left unchecked. The events that unfolded have left their mark, not as a scandal to be erased, but as a lesson to be remembered, a reminder that even the most enduring systems require vigilance to remain intact. From this moment, the monarchy emerges not weakened, but transformed, more guarded, more disciplined. The openness that once allowed quiet flexibility has been replaced with a firmer, more deliberate approach, one that prioritizes stability above all else. It is a recalibration born not from failure, but from confrontation and acknowledgement that the preservation of legacy demands not only tradition, but the willingness to defend it when necessary. And at the heart of that defense stands Princess Anne, her role now cemented in a way that extends beyond duty into definition. She is no longer simply a figure within the structure, she has become one of its anchors, a stabilizing force whose actions have reshaped the course of this internal reckoning. But perhaps the most enduring outcome of this chapter is not found in who acted or who yielded, but in the principle that has quietly reasserted itself above all else: duty. Not as an abstract ideal, but as a living obligation, one that demands sacrifice, clarity, and, at times, confrontation. Because within the monarchy, personal ties may influence decisions, but they do not define them. The institution endures because it places itself above the individuals who serve it, no matter how central those individuals may be. And as the palace settles into this new phase, that truth stands clearer than ever, echoing through every corridor, every decision, every carefully measured step forward. Because in the end, the crown is not just worn, it is protected, defended, and, when necessary, fiercely reclaimed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.